days, has the COVID-19 pandemic entered the era of accelerated globalization? And let me present our today's speakers. So today we have Anastasia Likhachova, Deputy Dean for Research and Associate Professor, Faculty of Global World Economy and International Affairs of the Higher School of Economics, Sergey Udkin, a lead researcher of the Center for Situational Analysis and head of the Group for Strategic Assessment of the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, Karsten Kowalczyk, Associate Professor of the International Economics, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, and Siglin Tekskör, Director of Studies, EU International Relations and Diplomacy Studies Department, College of Europe. So let me go over the rules very shortly. So we have two teams consisting of two speakers, which will debate roughly an hour and a half, a question during a period of this hour and a half, and the debate will start and end with the voting by the audience, yes or no on the question. Then we will have the first round of the debates, 5 minutes for each speaker. Then we have a rebuttal or clarifying the positions, each minute for each speaker, each speech. And then we have time for speakers to pose one question to their opponents. This will take around 10-12 minutes. After that, we have comments and questions from the audience. And finally, each speaker delivers his final remarks. And in the end, as it was said, the audience votes again. So I think we can start the first voting. Please, Arek, help us. So please choose your answer to this kind of complex question. Has the COVID pandemic ended the era of accelerated globalization? Yes, so we can see that most of the audience thinks that it will end the era, and 36%. And we still have a part of the audience that didn't decide what's the final answer. Okay, so we'll remember these figures, and let's try to maybe make these undecided people take their final decision on the question. So I think we can start our debates with, for the position, yes, we have Anastasia Likhachova and Sergey Udkin. I think Anastasia Borisovna, please start. You have 5 minutes for your first opening remarks.
Okay, I'll try my best. So good evening, or hello everyone. I truly believe that to protect any position, yes or no, we have to clarify what we understand as a globalization, and if possible, we have to decompose this eternal notion. What is meant by globalization? Globalization in trades and goods, migration of capital, globalization of services or data. Do we understand it as a set of institutions or networks? If we decompose it one by one, we can see that COVID really played a very important role, but in fact, it didn't play some catalyst effect it played a catalyst effect, but it didn't launch some deglobalization processes that started before. So if we take a look on globalization in trade, if we understand it as accelerating inter-regional trade of goods, and the most typical symbol of US-China in terms of trade relations, or EU-China trade relations, global value chains and their progress. It began to slow down right after 2011, and the shift towards regionalization was very intense. for last 5 to 6 years prior to COVID crisis, already globalization transformed and passes of global trade were lower than passes of global economic growth. So trade ended up to be the major loco for international global growth. But the trade into the regions boomed, and the COVID crisis, in this fact, it really drove a nail. It slowed down inter-regional trade really hard. And what is even more important, because the economy can overcome half a year of problems, it raised the issue of fast and effective localization for critical goods. So the idea that you can completely outsource production overseas, not thinking about some breakups in value chains, this era ended mostly because of the reaction of national states to COVID. The second issue, data globalization, it went exponentially. It was a real boom and tribute to globalization before the COVID crisis. But what we observe now is that the trend towards greater state control of the internet, control over digital platforms, and the yesterday collapse of the Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram, it only raised the question of the role and balance of roles between state and that kind of companies. We hear more and more about the idea of digital sovereignty, and it really intensified during the pandemic. Largely due to the rising great power competition, and also due to greater worries of national governments over the information space and social stability. All the anxiety caused by the pandemic and counter-pandemic measures really changed the tone of dialogue between societies and governments. And here, internet is considered as a very important asset to be controlled. We could expect that data globalization, in terms of extremely free passage of huge flows, rising flows of data between multinational servers, this era would be different after the COVID years. Option number 3, if we understand globalization as a set of global public goods, systems, and networks, we also see that this idea is under threat, and it has been for a long time. For example, sanctions, financial sanctions illustrated that financial networks isn't a common good, that are the systems controlled by some particular authorities, like Office for Foreign Assets Control, for example, in the United States. We now, because of the rising crisis, we could expect stricter regulation of the market, a departure from the idea of public goods that are the basis of globalization to a much more realistic version, access to certain systems as a foreign policy or foreign economic asset, provided in exchange for something. The prospect for some distributed control systems doesn't look like tomorrow's solution, and we see states eager much more to get the control over the systems they are interested in. It means that in terms of further globalization of these networks, we would see a fragmentation of these systems. And option number 4 that I would like to analyze is globalization as a set of institutions. The model, what we saw during the pandemic very clearly, the model of an international institution as a source of shared principles, norms, rules, procedures, and sanctions for participants in acute moments of the pandemic crisis didn't work at all. It was observed primarily at the level of integration institutions, in the choice between undermining the principles of the institution and undermining the legitimacy of the national government at home, at local square. The choice was in favor of the latter for all large countries. In all 4 cases, we are forced to admit that not even the COVID itself, but the reactions of the states to it played with the globalization the role of gravedigger of the unconditional attractiveness of the idea itself. So to concluding, I would say that yes, COVID crisis ended up the era of accelerated pandemic, not only due to its own capacities, but due to reaction of national states to it. I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you for being in time for this part.
Try my best.
Yes. Then the next 5 minutes is the time of Sergey Udkin to deliver his arguments, please.
Thank you. I will try to continue what Anastasia just started, in a sense that people in the academia, they like to argue about definitions. So she spent quite some time explaining how globalization can be understood. And the first thing that I thought about when I saw the topic of our debate was how the era can be understood. Because when we speak about the end to an era of accelerated globalization, well, you can think of an era like 500 years, and probably it's not like for 500 years we had an accelerated globalization, even if some would argue that we did have globalization going back and forth. But we had accelerated globalization probably for the last couple of decades. After the end of the Cold War, we did have the acceleration. And that means that, well, if even for the next couple of decades, we will not have this accelerated manner of globalization, we can claim that the era has ended, the era of those couple of decades that we had this acceleration. And this is, in my opinion, indeed the case. Probably it was not completely caused by the pandemic. The pandemic was not the only source of that, and the problems related to this accelerated globalization, they piled up with the time. But the pandemic worked as a trigger, and it also worked as a catalyst for those globalization issues that were piling up. And at this point, we saw how the whole process that was seen as indeed unbreakable just a couple of years ago broke down. Nobody could believe just a couple of years ago that you could cut international travel to probably 10% of what it was before the pandemic. People would probably claim that a challenge like a pandemic would be the reason for all countries of the world to unite their efforts to develop a joint policy to act against the consequences of the pandemic. And what we see in reality is the opposite. Countries are going back to their national quotas. They try to develop instruments, not just on the level of the national powers, but on the level of regions, cities, that are very different from just another city in the same country. You may say that this is caused by the nature of the pandemic, but then this has consequences. This has consequences for people's mindset. And they think more and more in local terms. They think, what's happening in my city? What kind of rules we have in the place where I live? And they don't care that much even about what happens in other parts of their country, let alone in other countries. If they are safe, if they're okay, this is the most interesting to them. This is what concerns them most of the time. And this, of course, changes the focus. The number of people who were interested in international development was probably always a minority. But now this is a striking minority. Most people are looking at what's happening around them, what are the sanitary conditions in their places, what measures have to be introduced to battle against the pandemic. And I think for the next decade or maybe 2 decades, this will influence greatly politics and the way people address challenges around them. They will look for solutions on the national level, on the level of their countries, cities, and they will not trust international mechanisms that they believe, probably they believe it wrongly, but they believe broke down at the time of the pandemic.
Thank you for your speech. I just can assure you that each and every round, we start from this arguing of definitions. So you were totally right that academic people really like arguing on definitions. So we now we turn over to the team No, and I would like to ask Karsten Kowalczyk, Professor Karsten Kowalczyk, to start his speech.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to participate. I thought both Anastasia and Sergey made some very interesting and good points. Let me, as an economist, I should start with a definition as well, shouldn't I? So if we define globalization, which is actually a concept that we have struggled with for some years as well, as social scientists, as economists in particular, perhaps, because there's a lot going on. I will look at it as crossing of borders of goods, services, labor, and various types of capital, including technology, that is, ideas. So globalization, I will literally think of in those terms. And I do not believe, I'll cut to the chase and then I will fill it in a little bit here. I do not believe that COVID will have any fundamental long-term, perhaps not even medium-term effects on these categories. But let me be a little more specific. For goods trade is as old as we are as having walked on the planet. We have, Sergey talked about 400 or 500 years. We have been trading goods since forever. And it's very deep and comparative advantage, differences. We gain from trade. We gain from exchanging stuff. So COVID has not changed that. And this is not the first pandemic. It may not be the last. We will continue to trade. And in fact, the gains from trade, classical gains from trade, are even stronger when we are, well, they're not stronger, but they exist when we are separated, when we cannot interact in person beyond exchanging stuff. Secondly, services have been hit very, very hard, as we know, by COVID. Transportation, tourism has suffered greatly. Services have grown dramatically before COVID. Big setback. I think it will come back in various shapes and forms, and technology has in fact done that. We're sitting here talking to each other due to technological innovation. We are trading, exchanging ideas, thoughts. As for labor I think is a very difficult issue. Migration and even more so, but even the temporary movement of labor. And the temporary movement of labor, people traveling with work, that may very well be suffer a setback, and but their communication technologies, I think, are helping, again, as we're talking about here. Capital, the flow of technology, the flow of equipment, and so forth. There is no reason why COVID should slow that down. And I expect that COVID will have very little effect on this. And finally, technology, just knowledge. I think we are fundamentally, I'm almost taking an anthropological perspective here, but this goes back to really what are we hoping for? What are we striving for? People want to know, firms want to know, they want to learn, and I see no reason why COVID would change that. I do agree that globalization and some about whether accelerating or decelerating, there are a lot of other factors that are affecting the pace, the speed of globalization and politics very, very much. And we'll talk more about this through our conversation. But at a very fundamental level, I don't think COVID will do this. And I'll just add the final remark. I think historically, when we have something like an adverse shock like this, like an epidemic, the intuition is to go home and sit at home and isolate ourselves. Somewhat surprisingly, what you're doing is isolating yourself from those walking around you, but that doesn't mean that we have to isolate ourselves from people who are afar and who in fact have things to offer through trade and so forth. So I think the reconfiguration of some networks is very, very possible, and that this will very likely have some effect. But that I don't think of that as a deceleration of globalization. On the contrary, that could actually lead to an acceleration of international interaction and less at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And please, Siglinde Ekstøl, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, there are many things that I would actually agree on with all three speakers, surprisingly. But of course, the conclusion drawn would be more in line with what Carsten was just saying. I mean, globalization in the traditional sense, when we talk about trade, is of course about the increasing liberalization of trade and investments, especially, as Sergey said, since the 1990s. Which was fueled by the end of the Cold War, falling transportation costs, the diffusion of technology, the establishment of the World Trade Organization, the growth of its membership, the proliferation of free trade agreements, etc. Now, the economic impact of COVID-19 was or is massive. I think we all agree on that. The question is what will happen in the long run, whether it comes back or not. A lot of companies had to shut down production, shops, restaurants, cultural institutions had to close, travel was heavily restricted, etc. And the crisis has created winners and losers. But does it mean that globalization has come to an end? I don't think so. And I would like to illustrate that with 5 points. And actually, I like the idea of Sergey saying maybe the era has come to an end, but that means we might enter a new era of globalization. But globalization is still there, and it can still be a fast-paced globalization. So first of all, I think the trade has rebounded after the lockdowns very quickly. We see a strong recovery, but an uneven recovery across the world. And I think that's one of the problems. According to the WTO, world merchandise trade is expected to increase by 8% this year, after falling about more than 5% last year. So that's much better than previously estimated. And I think keeping the international markets open, even though there were some hiccups at the beginning of protectionism, is essential, or was essential for the economies to recover from the crisis. And of course, it's also very essential to have a rapid global vaccine rollout, especially also in the developing countries. Now, second, as Anastasia already said, the global financial crisis, among other things, have already slowed down globalization before COVID. And I remember the Economist has labeled this slowbalization. And there are other factors which have contributed to that. But I think this globalization will not be turned into outright deglobalization because there are no new important developments which can accelerate the process again. And this is then my third point, and that the world has been and is adapting to the new situation. So to a large extent, societies have managed to maintain a somewhat normal life because goods have been delivered to our homes. We have been able to keep in touch and work through digital platforms, as Carsten said. Access to global markets has softened the economic impact in many ways. International trade has become less paper heavy. Of course, logistics companies have played a crucial role in keeping the economies running, But I think what COVID really showed is that there are risks of complex international supply chains. And it has showed it in particular, of course, now in the health sector, but it goes beyond that. And governments, companies are therefore carefully analyzing their supply chains for vulnerabilities, for over-reliance on one or few sources, and they will try to boost resilience. So we might have less of just-in-time production, more just-in-case stockpiling in some sectors. But I think there will also be search for diversification, and that will also create more trade and contribute to a re-globalization. And fourth point would be that cross-border e-commerce has grown and keeps on growing. So that's why I said we might be entering also to some extent a new era of globalization. This crisis had actually accelerated the shift towards digital services. And we have named a few, like video conferencing, working from home, online purchases, consulting doctors online, sending design files to 3D printers, etc. Face-to-face meetings might be less important in the future than they have been for now. So that could mean less travel, less need for office building, but it also creates demand for new goods and international trading services that can be delivered over internet, IT equipment, etc. And the fifth point would be that actually many new trade agreements are still being negotiated, especially in Europe and Asia Pacific. So currently, I think there are 350 FTAs in force. And in the first half of this year alone, 17 new ones were notified to the World Trade Organization. So to conclude, I would say that instead of any deglobalization, we just might be witnessing an evolution towards a different kind of globalization. And in my view, this new globalization should then also better address concerns such as public health, climate change, etc., so that we are moving towards a more mature and more responsible globalization. So in a nutshell, I would say we see a reorganization of globalization and not its end. Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's time for a kind of rebuttal or a second round of speech for every speaker. Please make a statement on following on what you've heard from your colleagues, or what you want to add to your first round of speech. So please, we start again with the position yes, and Anastasia, please.
Thank you, Daria. First of all, thank you to my opponents, because I think that the dividing line here in this discussion is not just between yes or no team. The dividing line is between the perspectives of the economists and experts in international relations. And these perspectives are different, complementary, I hope, but different. If we can agree that pandemic created problems for the economies, troubles for various industries. As for international relations, as for security issues, pandemic transformed an anticipation of threats and risks. And for our field, it's extremely fundamental shift, because if we understand globalization through the economic point of view, through the prism of gains, of relative gains, for example, that's one story. So in this case, COVID is mostly the change of processes and the issue of extra expenses. If we analyze globalization from the IR or security point of view, we see the demand, and very intense demand, both from the level of the society and from the level of governments, to reconsider their understanding of acute risks, acute threats, and how to manage them, on which institutions inside the state and in international systems state could rely, because globalization was one of the pillars of international IR theories, especially if we speak about liberalism as a theory for international relations. All these norms building, cooperation as a specific an extra good per se, because it creates the atmosphere of trust. For this concept, COVID really became a very important challenge. To my opinion, mostly because it showed an almost complete inadequacy of existing systems, institutions, and national security systems to global subjectless threats, So the threats, when we cannot easily fix a bad enemy, an alternative other, some enemy that we have to beat, that we have to deter. With the COVID, it was almost very hard to do. The pandemic illustrated an extreme inflexibility of national governments. Even in this case, they still inertially made a bet on the enemy deterrence model. They closed borders. And in this case, they defined actually first the whole world and then some particular countries as a carrier of the threat. However, the virus was a threat or some particular individuals were a threat. And this fear of national states to non-anthropomorphic enemy, to my opinion, could really change the attitudes of many national governments to globalization. And it could have serious consequences, not only for counter-pandemic measures, but to other non-subject threats, especially climate change. There is no climate Hitler, and against which countries can unite by now. The rhetoric of climate nationalism emerged and manifested itself precisely after the first waves of the pandemic. 2-3 years ago, it was very hard to find that kind of rhetorics. So in terms of anticipation of threats, to my opinion, pandemic played a very important role. And many national governments, many international organizations failed to meet it properly, to address it as a new kind of threat. And it simultaneously created extra fears for the societies. They felt themselves alone with this new threat. And at the same time, it ruined many existing networks built on trust and cooperation that we see, for example, in International Health Organization. So I would stop here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. The next speaker is Sergey Udkin. Please go ahead. We have 4 minutes here for each speaker.
Yeah, I will again use what Anastasia already said, and indeed there is a different angle that you get when you look as a political scientist, as an international relations researcher on that, and I would add that not all of that shift in the minds of people and in the societies is rational. So basically, what we heard from our participants who argued for a no in this debate, we heard that there are rational arguments for keeping globalization going, that basically the world trade would benefit from global linkages, from the production chains that could still help people gain wealth and bring the economies back on their feet. But the problem is that political choice is not always rational, that you do have people having all sorts of ideas on what's right, what's wrong. We just saw to what kind of serious clashes this led in the United States during the Trump presidency. And this might not be the last blow of that kind. So be it due to this accelerated globalization, or if we do the research, we will find other reasons. But you do have significant disadvantaged communities in every country, including the most prosperous, who do think that this is because of those globalized elites that travel around the world, that lost connection with their nations, that they don't get the share of wealth that they deserve. And they think that probably if this global movement is not necessarily stopped completely, but slowed down, if there are breaks pulled by national governments, if there is more talk in the town about the national priorities, about putting our country first, then this will be resolved. Probably they are wrong on that, but this will drive their political choices. And this will influence the global environment. In more and more countries, you will have people who will tell you, well, fine, we had those made in China items sold everywhere for such a long time, but isn't it the time to decouple? Yes, we were satisfied with those items, but now it's the time for us to produce more ourselves, or to produce more in the alliance that we are part of, be it the European Union or similar arrangements. And we do not want to outsource jobs, production chains to other parts of the world, because we don't feel it's secure, we don't feel it's the right thing to do, even if this is sort of more profitable in purely economic terms. So this is what you will hear more and more, and this is also underpinned by the desire that many people have for sort of restating their identity. You have a number of leading scholars now speaking about the importance of identity, including those like Francis Fukuyama, who was not known for praising this kind of line of thinking before, who say, yes, we probably thought that the identity issues will remain like a relic of the past in this globalized world where everybody would feel better off eventually. But no, people get back to their nations, to the feeling of national pride. And this will play a role in what they will decide in their lives, in their economies, in the legislative process in their countries. So all of that will be more sort of national and less globalized in the couple of decades that we will witness in the nearest future.
Thank you for your comment. Now we turn over to Team No, and Professor Kowalczyk, please, it's your turn.
Thank you. So let me suggest the following. Just let me start with a simple example. When you look today at international sports, and you look at, say, a good soccer game, football game, as it's called in the rest of the world, one thing that has struck me is that you see players from different nations after a well-fought match putting their arms around each other. Okay? International interaction, international camaraderie. So there's a functionality on the field, but I think if, Francis Fukuyama may have some valid points, but I'm not sure that we do not have that the last many years have not basically made us understand each other better, and that there is an empathy towards each other across borders, number one. Secondly, unlearning. I actually think that COVID has, and now I'm stepping into the political realm, so now you have to be kind to me and generous with me here. But I think COVID has put pressure on national governments. And I think in some nations, people have gotten concerned about lagging performances of citizens, residents of their national governments, because what people are saying is, why are we doing so poorly as compared to other countries that are somewhat similar, and they actually seem to be doing far, far better in terms of dealing with this pandemic. And we are actually able to even compare fairly similar economic and political systems, nations with fairly similar systems, in part because the communications sector, industry, and so forth is, news are traveling so much faster due to past globalization. So people are so much better informed. And I think this means that in particular for policymakers, there is now a lot of pressure to perform to a standard. And I'll say, by the way, it's apropos today, I think in New Zealand the Prime Minister just announced that she is realizing that zero COVID is not going to be possible in her country. And she, as we all know, has basically tried to close down the country, even on 1 or 2 instances of COVID. So I think that is now on trust, and this ties into trust. Yes, COVID has caused some issues on trust. This is very, very, very important, but you can see what I'm suggesting here is that it's not just international trust that has suffered. Intranational trust is suffering as well. And it goes back to my earlier point, and let me make it at perhaps a very fundamental level. There is a tradition in economics, and actually I think for us, people, so on. And in fact, on COVID, we actually have benefited greatly. And now I'm sitting here being the historian. We have the GISAID that was established some years ago by international researchers by their own volition, with some help by, in part, governments, but it was really a private initiative of sharing information on SARS and other infectious diseases. So we actually had an infrastructure put in place, and this is why we can now deal with a vaccine on COVID in an amazing time. I mean, this is within a year we have vaccines. So I really believe this is helpful for internet, sadly, but I don't see this as setting back international cooperation. I think people are recognizing, I hope, to some extent, that this solution may be coming from cooperating. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker for this part, Ms. Glenda.
Yes,
please.
Thank you. I'm actually not an economist, Anastasia. I'm an international relations scholar. Now, let me just pick up on a few points that were being said. Well, first of all, I think the pandemic as such is not new. Maybe its scale is, but we have similar restrictions on a lower scale. If you think of the SARS virus in 2002, the financial crisis, the volcanic ash cloud in 2010, that had also all kinds of effects on globalization or trade and travel, etc. Now, the real issue, I think, is also that the old type of globalization has created winners and losers. And you named some of them, like the Trump voters, or in France, for instance, we had this yellow vest movement, les gilets jaunes. But this was all pre-COVID, and I think COVID has maybe, had an impact on that it has made it worse. And I think the real issue with the old type of globalization is really that this negative consequence of distribution effects. So the inequalities that it has created and people feeling left behind. And I think this is something that needs to be addressed for sure. And the new type of globalization, if I may call it that, has to address that. That's why I wanted to stress that the digital divide between developing and developed countries, but also among different societal groups within a country, has to be overcome to avoid further income disparities. But also trust has been mentioned. And I think this is very important in terms of concerns about not just about, the state wanting to control something or big tech firms wanting to control something. It has to do with security, it has to do with data privacy protection. And that's why regulation, in my view, is actually important to create trust, because obviously things have not been regulated, or we didn't have the right rules. We don't have a real rule book yet on digital trade, for instance. And also this focus on the digital transition should be accompanied by a green transition for the future. That's where climate change and other things come in again, because both parts also have to address this issue of inequalities. And I would then agree with Carsten that, this also can help fuel innovation, and it can have positive spillover effects, because self-sufficiency, autarky is not an option, not even for the big economies, because of all these exchanges of ideas that we need, gains from specialization, comparative advantages, etc. Some countries have been talking about reshoring, so bringing back the production into their own country, but it's not really happening because it's very costly. And, so I think diversification and resilience building is much more important than reshoring or relocation into the home countries, so that the new developments that are keeping globalization alive and deepen it can be taken advantage of, such as e-commerce and trade in digital services. But we need to address the consequences, to learn the lessons from the old type of globalization, which was all about liberalization, and has created too many gaps between winners and losers. And I think we need to draw the consequences from that and learn.
Thank you very much. Now we have a time for questions from one team to another team. Each debater can ask one question to their opponents, no more than 1 minute for a question and 2 minutes for the answer. So our yes team speakers, Anastasia or Sergey, who would like to start with the questions?
Sergey, I started 2 times, so that can be you.
Okay. I have a question related to those innovations that were mentioned a number of times. Innovations are double-edged. So on the one hand, indeed, they improve our ability to work at a global scale, on the global level. On the other, they mean that you indeed can make more of your production, more of your economy work basically automatically. You need less people involved in that. And that basically means that the old production chains that developed all over the world are not needed anymore, because you don't need that much cheap labor that people found in Asia, elsewhere. You will be able to use the robots. Now, so the question is, do you think this will trigger a significant change in terms of interaction between different parts of this globe, or it will not for this or that reason?
Please, who would like to answer this question from no position?
Carsten, you want to go ahead, or should?
Yeah, please.
Sergey, that's of course a very, very good question, and perhaps not directly implied by COVID. But look, it's a fair question. It's a fascinating question, right? And I think we can all 4 of us and everyone can agree that that is a deep question. And whether innovation is labor saving or not, and in particular in manufacturing, let me suggest to you that even if it were labor saving in manufacturing, that services, as we know now, services is 70% of employment or more in many countries. And I think that looking ahead, where this process ends, who knows? But looking ahead, we are, and our children and grandchildren, because we can pay much more attention to each other, we can help each other more, we can educate each other more, we can travel more ways, learn more. 4-year-olds want to go to the bookstore instead of pushing little motorcycles around. I mean, I don't see, at least in the intermediate, perhaps not even in the long run, that would be a terrible thing if we care about, and we're careful about people who are pushed out of their jobs involuntarily. And I totally agree with all of you that the winners-losers issue is an issue. And let me just finally say, unlearning, I mentioned learning in terms of policy. I think one of the big things that have happened from COVID is that many people have, in some countries where there's no tradition for really at government level stepping in and feeding people at for a considerable time, that actually that has happened. Some countries have infrastructure, policy and social infrastructure in place. So if you lose your job, you're going to be okay for a while. Other countries less so, but they've stepped up. And I think that's been a learning experience, actually. Sieglinde, do you want to, I'm sorry.
Yes, if you want to add something, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think this shifts, you were mentioning cheap labor. I mean, this has happened already in the past decades. I mean, first, a lot of this production went to China. China has, through trade and economic growth, lifted millions of people out of poverty. China is now, in some ways, already too expensive. It has shifted to neighboring countries, Vietnam, Bangladesh, etc. So this is, of course, something that we have been observing for many years, and I think it will continue. But because robots are also expensive for sure, so from an economic point of view, the efficient allocation of resources will play in, but I think we cannot leave it at that. I think there are certain things where where politics has to come in, especially when it's concerning standards and certain regulation. I'm not talking about over-regulation or own population, but especially big business, they also care about their reputation, because some consumers might not buy their goods anymore if they know this was produced by child labor or other atrocious circumstances. And I think this is coming in more and more. And that's why I also think it's a new era that, takes other things than just economics into account, environmental norms and even human rights issues to some extent, even though I know it's a difficult issue, but I think this is now coming on the table as well. And maybe COVID has in that sense accelerated things, because it has shown much more bluntly where the problems are. So it has put the fingers on some of the inequalities, maybe. We'll know in a couple of years.
Yeah, thank you. Anastasia, do you have a question to the opponents?
Yes, I do. Could you agree that globalization will change its role as a common value because of the COVID, particularly because globalization seems to help people and societies to overcome the pandemic? And in contrast, they started to consider globalization as a trigger for pandemic, and that's why they have to close borders and adopt their typical life process, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to start answering this question? I guess
we'll take turns.
Yeah,
well, I think where you're right, that a lot of people might have perceived traveling as a problem, because travelers bringing the virus to their countries, and that therefore closing borders might be a good thing, or controlling borders. But when we talk about trade, we're talking about goods crossing, or services, goods crossing the borders, and in some sectors we had a huge short.
There is an increasing agreement, in part because of international cooperation. It may not have gone as far as we would like, that cooperation, but I think there is an understanding where this started, and you know, it may have been accidental. I think one would hope it was accidental, but, you know, it starts in a lab, more or less in a location. One of the reasons, by the way, why we know so much about the way this started is that for many years, the global community has had researchers in that area because this is where the flu originates year after year after year. So we're getting the flu shots because we have scientists, we have medical doctors and others who are in that area studying what is happening for any given season so we can modify these vaccines. That's international cooperation. And to say that globalization triggered COVID, I mean, we're commentators here, we're analysts. So these are not, you know, we're presenting what some people may believe. I think even take that on and then say, okay, so we have a country that is growing, and China is growing, it's becoming a very important economy in the world. And what's the alternative to international exchange and international commerce and travel? You know, China's becoming wealthier. People want to travel. They want to learn about the world. And, you know, so what's the alternative? What's the alternative? And so I think when sometimes one has to sort of lean back and really look at the big picture. So I think that argument is actually fairly easy to argue counter, to dismiss. But I think absolutely it's held in many quarters.
Thank you very much. Questions in exchange from team no to team yes. Who would like to ask the first question?
Okay, I'll go first. You have been talking also about institutional governance or global governance, the institutions that we have or don't have to deal with globalization. And what would you like to see in terms of global governance? What do you think should happen in terms of global governance reform? Should the WTO be reformed? And if so, how? Or are there alternatives out there to cope with these issues?
Okay, do you want to start or should I?
Yes.
Well, that's a very important question. What I think is could be described as an area of possible, not probable, but possible, is reconfiguration of financial assets managed by international institutions, especially international development institutions, and their role in the overpass of the emerging crisis, many crises, in fact, that we face now. Otherwise, I would expect that the role of lots of intergovernmental institutions would be limited to some secondary negotiation platforms. Also, I think that in some particular areas, some systems with allocated control, I would call it like blockchain approach, but I mean, it's not exactly the technological format, but the idea is an absence of monopoly of control over some particular networks managed by some institutions. The way how to allocate this control is the issue for mathematicians and diplomats to find the proper solution. But to my opinion, it's manageable task from game theory applied into international politics and economics. And third, I think that the existing institutions that want to survive, they have to be very concentrated in doing the things they can fix on their own. I mean, if we take an example, for example, of the Arctic Council, they have to be really concentrated into the projects they could lead and they could fix and ended up by the proper time. If that kind of institutions now would start to completely reconsider their agenda, the chance that national governments would just skip them and limit their already limited capacities is very high.
Sergey, if you want to add something, let us know.
Well, maybe a small point. I think there are all sorts of bright ideas that could improve global governance, but the problem is basically that there is no popular support for most of them. And it looks like at this moment that the most effective mechanisms of global governance are those that are low profile and that can be kept low profile. So basically, when you have some swift banking arrangement that helps you transfer money around the globe, and people find it sort of convenient, they don't even think about that. This works, and that's okay. And the same happens with some WTO arrangements with some standards that work around the world and that help people. They don't even think about that. At the point when they start thinking about global arrangements, that becomes something of a trouble, because when you think like, well, should we transfer money to some international institution up there, or we would rather keep them for ourselves? There is this selfish instinct that was probably boosted by the pandemic to keep things to ourselves, to keep the decision making on our level rather than outsource it somewhere. And this will probably become a bigger trouble in the years to come. So I don't expect any flourishing global governance, be it because of the pandemic or just in chronological terms after the pandemic.
Thank you. And we have time for a final question from Karsten, if you would like to ask something.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this issue on governance is and the best international structure of best quote unquote of structure of international cooperation is fascinating. And let me ask whether you think that you talk about low profile collaborations. What do you think? There's also the issue of flexible versus less flexible cooperation. And do you think we're going to see more regionalism, more regional cooperation? And where do you think that the multilateral cooperation may be the more effective, in particular as caused by COVID? So do you think COVID can strengthen multilateralism over regionalism, or do you think it's going to weaken multilateralism over regionalism? Thank you.
Who would like to answer?
I will probably start this time. I think it all depends very much on which region we are talking about, because of course there are different constellations of countries that can or cannot work together. In the last couple of years, we saw that even for the European Union, which is seen as the most advanced form of regional cooperation and even like shaping common policies, it's not easy to develop a common policy on COVID issues and in many other areas. So it's not impossible. It's not like the EU is a failure, not at all. It will develop further, but it does have serious issues to tackle in order to be efficient. And that is the most successful regional group. In other regions, we have even more troubles that make it hard for countries to come together and to tackle challenges together. So I still feel like when people indeed hope to take decisions fast and in appropriate manner, they will look more and more at national governments that will use some of those multilateral frameworks and regional frameworks as an add-on, as something that helps them in certain cases and something they can drop when they feel they're not helpful. So this kind of ad hoc attitude to international institutions is probably what we will see in the years to come, even if this is suboptimal if we judge purely from an academic point of view?
Well, I would just add, if possible, a few words. I completely agree with Sergey's views, but I would add that the risks of this ad hoc approach that looks very attractive from many states, from the very big one like the United States, dealing with the United Nations, for example, or China or Russia, and to small states, they don't want to invest their efforts, particularly in institutions of the European Union, like Hungary at the moment, or Slovakia or Slovenia. But we all know that the problem of this ad hoc approach, if everyone shares it, is a free rider problem. So the institutions will very quickly fail if they would be operational only in ad hoc format. I mean, some ad hoc solutions could be there, but ad hoc institutions as a norm, well, I think it's a bit oxymoron for the midterm forecast. I would also add that the idea of some regrouping of states from AUKUS to Greater Eurasian Partnership, that's the issue that we will see a lot in the news in the coming few years. But the real fulfillment of these initiatives into some cooperative co-actions, that's, to my opinion, is much more skeptical perspective for coming few years when countries would deal mostly with the crises.
Thank you very much for your comments. Now we have time for questions from the audience. So, dear watchers, if you would like to make a question or a comment as well, please raise your hand here on Zoom, or you can also submit your question via chat. Please, we'll wait a little for your questions. Or you can write a little bit later. So I think we can, so for this point, we can start our final remarks from each speaker. And I think no more than a couple of minutes, just some final words. So should we start from yes team? Please, who would like to start? Anastasia, I guess.
Well, just a concluding remark is that, of course, pandemic of COVID-19 is not the worst thing that the humanity faced. And hopefully it won't be the worst thing. And various waves of globalization, that's a great topic for discussions of historians who could start their talk from a couple of thousands of years before the Christ, or focusing on the new globalization of the long 20th century. To my opinion, what we can conclude mostly surely that the idea of globalization as we knew it in the second part of the 20th century were really ended up and find its grave under the COVID crisis. Whether we will see the reinvention of the idea, it's possible, but the globalization in the previous version is over. Thank you.
Sergey, please.
I would probably turn our debate a bit in practical terms, and indeed, what this would mean for practice if we ask, if we answer yes or no to this question of our relationship between our pandemic and globalization. And my feeling is that if we basically say that yes, this era of accelerated globalization is over, it means that we have to brace for impact from globalization. We have to be ready that there is a sequence of negative things arriving because of the pandemic and after the pandemic chronologically. And this is what I'm fearing and what I think we have to get ready for. And we have to be ready to tackle those very disturbing challenges that will be coming our way because of the pandemic and after the pandemic. If we say that, well, the economy will just bounce back then we can relax and do nothing, which is probably not the right option in these circumstances, because indeed, rationally speaking, of course, everybody would benefit from economy bouncing back, but not everything in the history of humanity happened in the rational way that just improved everybody's wealth. Things happened also because of different reasons, and we're going in different directions, back and forth, and this shaped the human history. So the 21st century may not be necessarily much more rosy and rational than the centuries that we lived through before that.
Thank you. Time for no team. Please, Karsten or Siglinde, who would like to start? Professor Kowalczyk, please.
Thank you. I do have to say, since I am apparently the only, well, we've all done economics and a bit of political science, or a lot of political science, and of course, to propose that people are not rational, of course. Well, Anastasia, you're talking about game theory, and Sergey, you're giving a hard time on rational. I think we need to be careful about not underestimating the individual out there. I think the individual, the mother, the father, the young man, woman, any gender, they strive. The person, these individuals strive, and to say that we have individuals who are an individual being rational, that does not imply that collectively we're going to come up with rational decisions, however we define them. But I think we need to be careful with not being completely dismissive of the individual and their hopes and aspirations. So I'd like to make that point. This is a very important point for me to make. Yeah, and on I think COVID. So getting back to COVID in particular, I think COVID has laid bare some issues that people were not talking about, communicating about all that clearly. And in particular, going to the points that have been raised by everyone, and about inequality, and that it's becoming clear that some people have high income, low income, or opportunities, difficult work situations, and so forth. I think that COVID has laid some of that bare. Some countries have these issues about opportunities and about income inequality and so forth have been dealt with or talked about for many, many, many years. And in other countries, less so. And I think that but I think that the impact of COVID on clarifying what our conditions are in our daily lives should not be, going to the refrain before, should not be underestimated. And I think it will be addressed politically. And I think we're going to see more globalization. And in fact, the countries that have historically have looked at these issues and address them with, social infrastructure, education, blah, 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 they have actually been very pro-globalization historically, some of these countries being fairly small, going to the point that some of you made. We're sitting here in large countries, but there are a lot of small countries out there. And these small countries, they are completely aware that there is no way they can address the health issues, the health solutions from something like this on their own. You need international cooperation. So we should, I think, keep that in mind as well. And I do appreciate that you raised that point. So I think globalization is not done. On the contrary, we're going to see, I think, a considerable boost in it, perhaps even. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Siglinde, the most
famous last words. Well, I would of course agree with Karsten that COVID is not ending globalization, but it helps transforming globalization. But I think we should also be careful not to blame everything on COVID. I think there's also a conflation of factors. I mean, COVID is one thing, but there have been many other things that have already contributed to ending the old type of globalization and shown the need of a new type of globalization. And I think in particular, we should also be careful what politicians are saying about COVID, because it's very easy also to misuse COVID for all kinds of purposes. I mean, you know, it's a perfect scapegoat for many things. So I think citizens would also have to have an eye on that. And yeah, I mean, speaking from a small country here in Belgium, we can only underline that international cooperation is essential. It's no wonder that Belgium, for instance, even though I'm not Belgian, is very pro-European integration because of its history, because of its location, and because it has learned about the benefits of multilateralism. Of course, it's a different thing if you want to extend it to the global level. The countries have different policies on this, but I think it's really important and worth showing what the potential benefits are of international cooperation, and to come to a globalization 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever it is, the era, that is better, so that we actually use the COVID pandemic to learn lessons. I mean, if I look at the history of the European Union, the European Union has often come up with reforms after crisis. It's often a trigger, things that they have been quarreling about for years before. All of a sudden it was possible because there was a crisis, and it can be an external event or an internal event. And Sergey said it as well, the EU has not been doing very well at the beginning of the pandemic. That's because the EU has no legal competences in this field when it comes to health policy or borders. That's the member states. So, and now they're also thinking about, what does that mean, and should we not improve the pandemic preparedness for the future? But of course, there can be other crises happening and not just pandemics. But I think it's important to draw the lessons from it and to be skeptical about, whether COVID is used just as an excuse for all kinds of policies. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So then we come to the final part of today's debate. Before we start voting, I would like to thank our speakers for this insightful and useful for all sides, I hope, conference. And I think that it's a huge theme for discussion, and it would be interesting to rewatch this discussion in several years and look what we would have by that time. But now let's try to answer the question again. I think we can start the poll. Please vote. What do we have? So to do the rest of the audience still undecided. Okay.
It's high. That's a lovely result.
It's perfectly balanced. Well, I could welcome our team now for their progress and more balancing views of the audience.
Well, we want to congratulate you on just it's a real joy to have this conversation, and and you're making really wonderful points. And look, I think we all feel a little bit put in a box because we're arguing one or the other. And I think this format was just fantastic. Actually, it's thrilling to work with colleagues across borders like this.
Yes, the results are really interesting, and seems like both sides were enough persuasive to to make an effect on both sides. So okay, so thank you.
I hope we'll be able to continue this offline one day, and this and other debates.
Yes, sure.
And even in person, maybe. No.
That would be great. Yes. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for today's final round of the debates, for your ideas and thoughts to the topic. We will be happy to see you on future events in cooperation with Fletcher School and Russian International Affairs Council. So stay safe and have a good evening in Russia and in EU, and good day to our colleagues in Boston. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you all. Very, very enjoyable.
Recording stopped.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.